Hello, and welcome to another episode of Living a Culture of Life podcast. I'm your host, Colleen Haupt, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet, our president.
Once again, great to be with you.
Good to be with you, Father. And this is a little bit of a follow-up to our previous episode. In our previous episode, we were talking about the Respect Marriage Act, which is trying to enshrine LGBTQ unions as recognizing them as legal marriages. And this is going to be talking about Title IX, and it's another example of the current administration trying to enshrine their agenda into all aspects of our society, but in particular with Title IX into the school system. So we're going to jump right into that, Father. So let's go in. What is changing with Title IX, or potentially changing?
As I always do, is direct people back to the main column, the written column with all the links. And I know that we do that very much on our podcast to help people to know where the links are. So because there's so much detail, Colleen, to this that it's good for the reader to be familiar with. So we know that, if we look at where Title IX is, so we got to go back to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So this is where we go back to the fact where we passed legislation, signed into law, that it was wrong to discriminate against people because of sex, color, and other issues in the sense of, I'm going to read it from, based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And so, of course, much more detail. And then what we saw in 1972 was a continuation in Title IX, which is on the educational components of the Act, of the Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. And so in 1972, we would see new legislation come forward to recognize, and I'm going to read from it. So in 1972, it prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or any other educational program that receives funding from the federal government. Now, as we know, as we talked about with the Respect for Marriage Act, so we have here is we're talking about federal government. So how does this affect the actions and funding of the federal government? So as we saw with the Respect for Marriage Act, wanting to enshrine same-sex union as the law of the land, and that would be followed in every state and so forth. And as we said in that podcast, Colleen, we talked about Oberville versus Hodges in 2015 by the Supreme Court that then overturned, the DOMA, which was the definition of always get that one a little
Defense of Marriage Act.
Defense of Marriage Act, signed into law by then President Clinton in 1996. And so that now, which identified that marriage from a federal government definition is between one man and one woman. And so that was the union that the government on the federal level recognized. Mm-hmm. That was challenged, obviously, throughout many iterations over the years. But in 2015, under Oberville, the Supreme Court's majority overturned the law and then imposed upon our nation that every state had to uphold and legalize same-sex union. So here we are now because, so it's always good to connect the dots as we try to do, is because of the decision of the Supreme Court on June 24th, that was publicized on June 24th. The decision was before, but made public, that overturned Roe versus Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood. And as a result, because of a comment made by, in a good way, by Justice Clarence Thomas, who is talking about the very fact of these so-called penumbra of rights and privileges that so-called that the justices, when they imposed abortion upon the United States, said there was a right to, and so points out, well, as a majority made clear, in overturning Roe can be applied also to other issues, one being the Oberville case. Mm-hmm. So that's what brought to bear the Respect for Marriage Act that they're trying right now to currently pass through the Senate. It's already passed the House. Mm-hmm. So just to help our listeners remind us what we talked about. And so what we have here is another example of the Biden administration and the current leadership within the Congress trying to enshrine its ideological principles and to impose those principles upon the entire citizenship of the United States. And so here's an example that they're using now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and obviously its iterations over the years. And in 1972, in Title IX, involved what I read earlier, it prohibits sex-based discrimination in any school or any other education program that receives funding from the federal government. So that is the real point here, is the school or system that receives federal funding. So now what's happened with this current move under Title IX is to take that language and now expand that language. And that's where we are right now. So I think it's important, to see what's going on. So here what I would do is I'm going to come back to my column.
Okay.
And just to kind of help us by kind of gathering this language. So what does it do? And the rules would expand the definition of sex discrimination here. So 1972, I read it twice. Mm-hmm. So here now they're taking that word discrimination, sex discrimination, and now expanding it. And what are they doing? To include such things as sexual orientation, gender identity, sex stereotypes, which would include and sex characteristics. So it's now expanding. The new language, in other words, would take a law originally designed to protect women, right, from being victims of discrimination based upon their sex, and redefine sex discrimination so that it's impossible even to determine what a woman is. So it's really taking the language and imposing the current ideology that is being pushed by a particular segment of our society that wants to see its positions not only enshrined but literally forcing us to all accept and to live and to embrace. Mm-hmm. And so it's very important. And what I would also add here is I wrote a little later on in the column, Colleen, is the rules change the definition of pregnancy,
okay,
and to include abortion. So now we got to come back to what they're attempting to do. And other means is we're seeing right now where they're trying. The Congress has attempted to pass a new law, to pass a bill that would, again, enshrine the right to abortion. So since that did not work, all right, currently, thank goodness, is now what they're doing is finding another way to enshrine this so-called right. And they're using Title IX.
Interesting. And I feel like going back to the redefinition of sex discrimination and all of that, as a woman, I feel like that completely negates what Title IX was originally trying to do. If you can't even define a woman, how are you going to protect a woman from sex discrimination in the educational system? And then it seems like you were saying it's basically trying to find any type of loophole that they can to try to push abortion. So how is that going to affect pro-life states? Is that part of the struggle here that we're going to see?
So again, because you're dealing with, if this were to become law, so in other words, if this were to move through the House, passed by the Senate, signed into law. So remember 1972, this was the what we call the educational amendments in 1972 were signed into law by then President Richard Nixon. Mm-hmm. So here, if this were to become signed into law by President Biden, this becomes the law of the land. And so that now affects those systems, federal systems that are institutions that are receiving federal funding. So think of all of our public schools. Think of our universities. So you would see in any other institution that's receiving federal funding. So it would definitely affect the states. It would affect the ability of a state that, for example, in some of our states are currently passing legislation, signing into law where it recognizes women's sports are for women only, biological women. All right, it's identified to protect women. Right now, as many articles have been written that the very law that was meant, as you just quoted, to protect women, to allow women to allow their gifts and their skills and their abilities in the sports and other ways to shine and to be protected from discrimination is the very thing undermining that. And so here you can see how states now, if this were to become law, now it would be challenged, but we have to go back to that whole legal process again. And this would be very bad for the states. Another example of a bad law that would impose federal positions upon the states. And so you might have a state that really is wanting to advocate for women, advocate for women's sports, make sure that there is no discrimination against women and to protect women from being discriminated against, now could be undermined by the federal government.
And then on the flip side, those pro-life states that are trying to pass pro-life laws are going to have that undermined by
That's
in the schools, I believe, right?
That's
Is
correct.
what you were saying.
Same thing with marriage.
Yeah.
So it's the same. So you can see how, that's why I love how why you wanted to try to connect the conversations, because they are connected. And so as we can see the issue with abortion, we can see how the issue affects the definition of marriage, and now we can see how we deal with the definition of male and female. And so we can see how the whole transgender ideology gets into this. We can see how the issues of the whole LGBT community gets into this, and those advocating, for their positions. And the federal government is the one advocating. I mean, what more powerful institution can you have than the whole arm of the federal government advocating on your behalf? And so this again pushes down. And they're not listening, obviously to the states and others who are saying this is not good law. This is not the how we should be approaching this subject. This is not how we should be dealing with the issues of sex discrimination. And we're changing language and creating new language in order to enshrine an ideology. So the idea of connecting, as I said earlier, the definition of pregnancy changes. I also go on to say, we know that pregnancy is a natural process. A new life begins at the moment of fertilization. This human being is not just that; it's just that, a human being. We know this. Okay, I'm just quoting from my own paper. But abortion, in contrast, is an intentional, direct destruction of a human life. It kills the preborn baby, all right, and halts the natural process of pregnancy. So, this is not, I'm quoting again from Melanie Israel in an article that I'm using as the kind of the base of the article. This is from Melanie Israel. And so she's showing that how absurd this is, all right, and trying to equate these two things to each other. They're not. They're separate things, and they're very distinct things. That pregnancy is what it is in a sense of, and abortion is an act. So, but again, this is how we see this ideology become enshrined. And so imagine if that were to become the law. Now, how do you fight against that?
Yeah. And when it fits into the education system too, how do you get it out? Like, that's just going to be subjecting, in a weird way, children to, even if it's not putting these ideas into the classroom, by having this control over school system, you're going to be able to get things into the school system, into children's minds in a way that you wouldn't.
Well, we already are seeing it. We already seeing this because, in other ways where the federal government has imposed itself, into the state level because of federal funds, because of the way federal funds are allocated, that we can already see this happening in many of our public systems from grade school all the way up into the universities and colleges. And we already see it in sports. We already see it. We have many, many examples of this already before us, and they don't end well. And so just because we redefine it, it's not going to miraculously make it all better. It's just going to continue to make it far worse. It's going to actually, and as many have said, including Ms. Israel, it's going to eradicate women's sports. Yeah. So and as I get into the article, men and women are built differently. And as I make some quotes in here from the Heritage Foundation, just kind of talking about, and that's something that distinctiveness and that beauty of being male and being female and the distinctive characteristics are something we should be protecting, and we should recognize that there are differences in the two sexes. And I think it's important, and we're allowing that language to get usurped by a redefinition. And it's very dangerous, but that danger can now be imposed as a law, and it makes it more and more difficult for schools and others to fight against it because they're so dependent upon federal funds, and the federal government knows it. Mm-hmm. So they know where their leverage is, and that's why they're trying to do this.
Why do you think there's such a push right now to normalize this on a federal level, to try to push it down into the states? Is it just because they have the control right now in the House and the Senate? Like, they have the bodies to be able to push this through, basically?
Yes. And, okay. And again, I also believe that with that is, as we're seeing, challenges on the legal level. Mm-hmm. And to believe that even if this were to become law, that it would not be challenged, it's going to be challenged.
Yes.
And so it's not, it's the insanity of thinking that just because it becomes, but they know that it will take time. And in the meanwhile, it becomes enshrined. It becomes into process, it becomes into policy, it becomes into procedures, and as we know, under presidencies where life and family causes were being defended, that how tentacled all these policies are, and how to extrude them, is not an easy task. Same, or excise them, maybe a better word, but to recognize that if this were to become law, and we have 2 or 4 more years or 6 more years or 8 years before we can move it through the system to challenge it, it's so now inculcated itself into all these policies and procedures, it's going to be very, very hard to pull. Meanwhile, how many people have been affected by this? What has been the consequence or the effects of it and effects of it? The damage will have been done. And so, and this is, unfortunately, they know that because it's succeeded in many other ways. So we need to recognize what is really being attempted here, and recognize that we need to stand up against this. And we need, again, get in touch with our senators, in touch with our representatives in the House of Congress, in the U.S. Congress. We need to voice our not only our discontent, but outwardly reject this bill and say this is unacceptable, and again bring that into the voting booth as well. We have to voice ourselves here.
Well, and I think this is a good one, that's a good topic to be able to dialogue with people who may not agree with you too, because a lot of people will agree that women shouldn't be discriminated against. Right. So if you can bring to people's minds that, this is going to basically undermine everything that Title IX originally stood for. Right. It's just going to undermine it. That's a great way to get across to someone that maybe they should be, there's problems with this. And you were saying in our previous episode, bringing it to the public forum, writing about it, correct, dialoguing with people. And at least from my perspective, this seems like a good little edge that you have of something that a lot of people will agree on, that women should have representation in sports and shouldn't be
equal representation and protection.
Yes.
And protection. And also with that, it's a realization that you have a document that might have, at the very beginning, was 37 words long, over 700 words and plus.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, why do we need so many words? Because of what they're trying to impose.
And yet I think you said they never actually defined sex.
No, they don't.
In all those 700 words.
None of it. But what they do define, is and redefine pregnancy, sex discrimination. They redefine other terms, and it's again. Remember, there's a phrase, and I never remember. There are many people who have used the phrase, twisted a little bit to fit what they were explaining. But the phrase is whoever controls the language controls the mind and the heart of a nation. So whoever's controlling the language here. So here's the federal government, using its strong arm to change the language. Now, the Civil Rights Act, talking about the issue of discrimination, we would want the positive of that to be something we do uphold. Yeah. Discrimination is wrong. We should not be discriminating against someone because of race or color or creed, period. And at the same time, we will never should not advocate discriminating against anyone because of some difficulty in the sense, or maybe someone's orientation, and how they perceive themselves. At the same time, we have to have some limitation here because of how the power of law and how law does, bring upon a nation a mindset and an understanding. And so here, as we talked about with the Respect for Marriage Act, as quoting Archbishop Cardinal Leon, that it's not a live and let live mentality here. There's a mindset of wanting to impose and have each of us embrace it. And here, the recognition is that we want to make sure that there is no discrimination, and at the same time, we want to protect, these values and advance them. Now, what I mean by that is what you were just talking about, Colleen, and that is to defend women, in women's sports, and allow that to and I shouldn't say allow it, but in the sense of really to let women's sports, be what it is, to allow women to have their skills and all their abilities, shine and to excel and to exceed, in the sense of and succeed is my word I want to say. And I think it's beautiful, and I think it's a challenge right now that this is going to do. It's going to undermine that.
And not to get too much into the weeds of the details, but I believe you said this is also going to affect healthcare because of the Affordable Care Act and I believe it refers back to Title IX, was what you were saying in the article, that the Affordable Care Act defines sex discrimination the exact same way that Title IX does. So by changing this in Title IX, you're also going to have all of these effects in the health system.
That's correct. So, and you summarized it perfectly.
Okay.
So, no, I think it's very important to see that. So here we're talking about education and educational systems, but how that also flows into the Affordable Care Act. And the language that's being used here is the same language that's going to be used on the other side. So absolutely. Absolutely.
And then also there's new HHS regulations, I believe, that kind of parallel this, just as another example of pushing this agenda.
Yes. So again, using the federal arm, the strength of the federal government in all of its agencies. So we just named. So here we would have a law, that is that is a federal law. So it affects all citizens across the United States, all of the states. Then you have how then through the Affordable Care Act, so how through the federal funding of healthcare, how itself, this language now becomes part of healthcare, and how we define certain terminology and approaches. And we can see how through Health and Human Services, how that now becomes reflected throughout the whole healthcare, agency throughout the United States, and especially those receiving federal funds. So it's really, it's more than the law here. It's how it's going to push itself through all the mechanizations and processes and policies and operational procedures throughout the federal system. So you can see how intrusive this is, and how something can be on a positive side, and you would want to see it infiltrate all the system. Fine. Here we have something that's not good, and it's very wrong, and it will have a devastating impact, and each of us will be affected by this. Especially our young people, especially in the school systems, and as we said, in healthcare. So imagine if you were a doctor, a nurse, in the vocation of health, how is this going to affect you? Mm-hmm. So, and actually, in the article, I make note of that, and I think maybe it's a good, to look at. Now, this is, again, using someone else's, statement and just kind of building on it. So the new Title IX regulations would significantly expand the definition of sex discrimination, which we've already talked about on the educational side, Colleen, to include discrimination based upon gender identity and termination of pregnancy. So changing terms. So this is what, the person I'm quoting here is Morrison. The HHS has recently proposed new regulations that mirror the Biden administration's proposed Title IX regulations on sex discrimination. These proposed regulations would make it illegal to deny or limit health services sought for the purposes of gender transition or other gender-affirming care that's covered that the covered entity would provide to an individual. Now, he goes on to explain, and I'm just reading it because I think it's important with using the quote. That means that doctors and hospitals would be required to provide patients, including children, with puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, gender transition surgeries, and insurance providers would be required to cover the expensive drugs and procedures. So in theory, the HHS is still bound to respect the federal conscience right laws, okay? However, what's clear that the Biden administration's HHS is consciously pursuing the extremist agenda on abortion and gender. If this were to go through, I want you to think how this is going to affect conscience rights. And to say that it will not would be foolish. It definitely will. And so you can see how this really is it's not just affecting one area and someone saying, well, that doesn't affect me. No. It affects more than just one side of this equation. It affects the entire equation. And from our educational systems and institutions to our healthcare and to how the HHS, which is responsible for advancing the federal government's policies and procedures in healthcare services throughout the United States, will use its leverage, as we've already seen, with the issue of abortion and other issues in this regard as well.
And what can our listeners do to kind of combat all of this entrenching into all aspects of society? Right.
Well, as our listeners are obviously hearing, there's a lot of detail here, and it can be a little tongue twisting, to get all the terminology and to get all the intricacies of how they're connected. Is to educate oneself. One way is to actually come to the article itself. I have all the links in here that I'm talking about that'll bring them to these resources to familiarize themselves with the Title IX 1972 statement, and then what's been proposed up until this moment. There have been many other attempts, and there have been changes in augmentations, but in how now, what's being done now, and what does that language mean? How does it affect us? We need to educate ourselves. And this half-hour time is not going to give it the justice in the sense of all the details. We need to make sure that we understand what's at stake. The second thing, Colleen, is once we've educated ourselves and broadened our understanding of the issues, is then what can I do about it? So, those in positions of authority that can make in positions to make change possible. We need to do that. We need to recognize, how does this affect? If I'm a mother and father raising daughters, how does this going to affect my daughters? Going forward in time in the school system. How is this going to affect them if they go to college, or maybe they want to play sports? How are they going to deal with this? How is this going to affect our health care? Maybe I'm in healthcare already. Maybe I am a nurse, a doctor, a pharmacist, or maybe I am I'm in the insurance industry. How does this affect me? And to realize that it does. And so we all have something here to gain and to lose. And I think that's something that should motivate us, Colleen, to want to get involved. And if nothing more, is to say to the senator and to our representatives in the U.S. House to say, no, I'm opposed to this, and recognize that this is not something that we should be advocating and advancing. Write the local editor. Said before, will it get published? Keep trying. But if you're on social platforms and have the ability, I would say there are many people right now doing podcasts on this. There's many radio interviews that I know I've done. Others are doing. So people are trying to get this information out. But that's just one part. We need to do our part. All of us individually need to get involved. And when we get into the voting booth, we need to vote. We need to advance the principles that we know are for our good, the good of human flourishing, and for the common good. And there's nothing here that serves the common good. And definitely, as I've written and others have written, and you beautifully summarized, there's nothing in here in the sense of that's good for the protection of women and protecting women from being discriminated against. And I think that's important for people to recognize and to see how all of this becomes can be integrated into so many different ways of policies that we want to avoid them ever becoming possible. And we need to stop this in its tracks. So that's what I would recommend. And if you're looking for our Catholic brothers and sisters, the bishops themselves have made numerous statements. I quote from 3 different bishops here in this article. The U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops have leveled many statements in opposition, to the current bill. They've also voiced their concerns of how that bill what would happen. And for many in our audience, Colleen, they may not be aware of how active the Catholic bishops are in public policy in the sense of lobbying. And each of the states, Conference of Bishops, are engaged in this, and rightfully so. Pope Benedict used to say that we don't run away from this conversation, we run toward it. We're part of the human family, we're part of the human fabric, and we're part of the common good. And so we need to be part of that conversation, not sitting on the sideline. This is not just, as we saw with the Respect for Marriage Act, quoting Archbishop Cardinal Leon of San Francisco. There's an element in this that affects every one of us that is not a religious issue. So we need to not be afraid. That's what I would say to our listeners: familiarize yourself, know what is currently the law, what does the current law say, what would the proposed change say, and ask yourself, is this really good for women? Is this good for society? Is this going to be good for our children? Is this going to be good in our health care? Is this going to be good, in how this language, what does this language mean? And it's so ambiguous, we don't know what it means. And that's why it's 700 plus pages long.
Exactly. And it doesn't matter if you have a good state if the federal government's going to come along and impose these laws that are going to undermine whatever your state is trying to do too. So we can't become complacent and be like, oh, well, my state is defending women and pro-life. Yes, it might be, and that's great, and keep fighting for that.
Right.
But at the same time, we have to be aware of what's going to happen at a federal level that might impact that.
That's correct. And federal law trumps. So we got to remember this now. So that's why it's important to familiarize ourselves with what is happening on the federal level. So I hope that our listeners will see, as we have tried to do, is the linkage. And again, so much detail, so much information, but it's good if we just to read, familiarize ourselves so that we know how to address the subject, and to make sure that as we articulate that we're articulating with clarity as best we can, because again, it's hard to put into words into 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour podcast on a document so long, and to see how does all that language relate to all the various ways that we've been trying to articulate. But it would be good for people, and there are a number of groups out there who are dealing specifically with legal issues that share our concerns and that are out there as well, and and it can summarize and bring some of that into more clarity of why and how we can get involved.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Father. And I hope that both of these episodes were helpful for our listeners to be able to get a grasp of what's going on at a federal level, and hopefully be able to articulate it, fight against it, write letters to the editor, all of that good stuff. And so if you're listening on YouTube or Rumble, please remember to like, follow, subscribe. If you're listening on any of our audio platforms, please follow, share with your friends, download our episodes, and listen to them, obviously. And keep on living the culture of life. God bless.